There's a reason archivists handle old portraits with a quiet kind of reverence. They aren't just images, they're fragments of lives nobody remembers, pieces of history left behind by families who once loved, feared, celebrated, and endured. One such portrait arrived at the Hawthorne County Historical Archive in late spring, tucked in a brittle envelope alongside other forgotten relics from an estate sale. At a glance, it looked harmless, even charming. An early 1905 studio photograph of a little girl, no more than 6 years old, sitting primly on a carved wooden chair while holding a simple cloth doll in her lap. Her shoes were scuffed, her dress slightly oversized, and her hair tied back with a ribbon that had likely been white before time yellowed it. There was nothing unusual about the image, nothing threatening, nothing strange, unless you knew where to look. And once one archivist finally saw the doll's face, he couldn't unsee it. The portrait sat untouched in a stack of hundreds until a routine cataloging session placed it beneath the soft glow of an afternoon lamp. That's when the junior archivist, Daniel Morrow, stopped mid-sentence while documenting its condition. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He lowered his glasses, blinked twice, leaned closer, then slowly rotated the photograph toward the light. The girl's expression remained the same, innocent, calm, compliant in the stiff way children posed for long-exposure cameras. But the cloth doll on her lap, its stitched face seemed strangely detailed for a toy from 1905, too detailed. The tiny embroidered mouth formed an expression that was subtly wrong, not a smile, not a frown, but something tense, tight, nearly grimacing. Worse, the doll's eyes weren't symmetrical. The left eye was stitched slightly higher, giving it the unnatural look of someone peering upward. And the right eye? The right eye didn't look stitched at all. It looked painted, layered, almost human. He thought it was a trick of aging, some discoloration caused by humidity or silver nitrate degradation. But when he held a magnifier over the doll's face, he saw texture. Not fabric texture, not thread, something else, something smoother, something unnatural amid the woven cloth. The right eye was glossy, reflective. It had depth, like it had been added later with ink or pigment meant to mimic a real human iris. And behind the gloss, almost hidden beneath the faded strokes, was something that tightened the air around him. A tiny, unmistakable glint of light, the sort of reflection you'd expect to find in an actual eye, not in a stitched toy from a rural portrait studio. He felt his stomach drop. He swallowed hard, unsure whether to laugh at himself or to call someone over. Instead, he placed the photograph flat on his desk and pressed his palms into the wood, steadying his breath as he scanned the rest of the image. The girl's posture was rigid. Her hands, though small, clutched the doll with a tense, almost protective grip. Her eyes, large and slightly downcast, didn't appear frightened, but they didn't appear entirely content either. There was something about her gaze that felt as if she knew more about the portrait than anyone who would ever see it. Daniel leaned back slowly. The room felt colder. He documented the photograph as best he could before calling in his supervisor, Dr. Miriam Keaton, a senior archivist known for her sharp instincts and refusal to sensationalize any discovery. She approached with her usual quiet stride, expecting another faded portrait, another cracked frame, another harmless relic. But the moment she saw the doll's face through the magnifier, she didn't speak. Her breath stalled. She adjusted the light, moving the lamp in small increments, testing the angles to see whether the eye would change with the reflection. But it didn't. The glossy eye remained, catching the light in the way real eyes do. She lowered the magnifier and exhaled. "This isn't typical," she murmured. "Not for a cloth doll, not for 1905, not for any rural studio." She paused. "And certainly not for a child this young." Daniel nodded hesitantly. "Could it be retouching?" he asked. "Some photographers used ink or pigment to fix details." Dr. Keaton shook her head slowly. Not like this. Not with depth. And not on a toy. Retouching was reserved for facial features, clothing shadows, the occasional background. No one enhanced dolls. Unless they had a reason. The room fell silent. Dr. Keaton requested the portrait's negative, but it hadn't been included with the estate items, which was unusual. Families often kept negatives, especially when they only had one portrait taken every few years. She turned the photo over, hoping for a studio address or a date. Instead, she found something unexpected. Something faintly scratched into the cardboard backing. It was nearly invisible to the eye, but under angled light it revealed itself. 3 small words, shaky and uneven, carved by a hand that must have been trembling. Keep her near. Dr. Keaton stared at the inscription. The handwriting didn't match any typical photographer's mark. It looked desperate, etched in haste. The letters had pressure marks, meaning whoever carved them pressed hard enough that the tip of a pen or needle nearly broke through the board. And the phrasing, the simplicity of it, felt like a plea, not a signature. Daniel looked at her nervously. Do you think it's referring to the girl or the doll? She didn't answer. Instead, she placed the portrait inside a protective sleeve and walked toward the archive photography room. She set up a high-resolution scanner and gently lowered the portrait onto the glass. Daniel watched her face as the machine hummed, capturing every pixel with forensic precision. The image appeared on the screen in sharp detail. The girl, the dress, the chair, the doll, and the doll's face. Under digital magnification, the stitched mouth looked strained, almost distorted, as though the threads had been pulled too tightly. The painted eye showed layered strokes that no amateur hand would attempt. Too precise, too deliberate, too knowing. The doll's face seemed to be looking not at the camera, but slightly past it, towards someone or something positioned just outside the frame. The more Daniel stared, the more wrong it felt. Dr. Keaton zoomed in even further, examining individual threads. She said, "There are 2 mediums here, standard cotton stitching and pigment, but this pigment doesn't match the era. It's too smooth, too uniform." She paused. This pigment wasn't applied in 1905. Daniel blinked. You mean someone altered it later? A long silence followed. Or someone altered it during the session, she finally whispered. He looked at her confused. Why would a photographer modify a doll? Why would anyone modify a doll? She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled up the spectral filter they used for damaged documents. When she applied it to the image, the doll's features shifted in eerie ways. Stitches brightened, shadows deepened, and the right eye, the painted one, seemed to hold a faint outline beneath the pigment. Something circular, something smooth, something that was not part of the original toy. And then Daniel saw it. Just beneath the thin layer of pigment, barely visible unless magnified to an extreme degree, was what looked unmistakably like the outline of a human iris, a real one. Not perfect, not complete, but detailed in a way no painter would have bothered to replicate on a doll meant to comfort a child. Daniel's voice trembled. "Miriam, what is that?" She leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "It looks like someone tried to obscure something. Something they didn't want anyone to see. Something behind the paint." He swallowed. "Behind the paint on the doll's eye? Why would someone hide anything there?" Dr. Keaton's answer came slowly, as if each word fought its way out. Because the doll's face originally had something else. Something the family wanted removed, or something the photographer refused to capture. He stared at her. "Removed? Like what?" She paused. "A real eye?" Daniel's mouth dried. "That can't be serious." "Not a literal eye," she clarified, though uncertainty flickered across her expression. but perhaps a representation of one, a painted symbol, a likeness, something meaningful enough to conceal, something the child was holding that should not have been photographed. He felt the chill before he understood the implication. "You mean the doll wasn't just a doll?" She nodded slowly, her voice heavy with implication. "It may have been an object, a vessel, a remembrance, something connected to someone else, someone the family lost." The room seemed to shrink as they stared at the magnified image, the little girl's grip on the doll now appearing harder, almost unnatural, her tiny knuckles pressed white even in sepia, her once sweet expression carrying a faint tension as though she understood she had been asked to hold more than a toy during that long exposure. Daniel's voice cracked as he whispered, "What do we do?" But Dr. Keaton didn't look away from the screen, answering firmly, "We find out who she was." That meant returning to the estate records, the abandoned farmhouse where the portrait had been found, a property once belonging to the Hollis family, a place with a dark history of loss, rumors, and a tragedy whispered in old county newspapers but never fully documented. The girl in the photograph was believed to be Clara Hollis, born in 1899, but the doll was not listed among her belongings, and the family records revealed something else that made Dr. Keaton sit down, gripping the edge of her desk as though the floor had tilted beneath her feet. Clara Hollis had a sister, a twin, a stillborn twin, unnamed, unburied, unrecorded in any census, mentioned only once in the shaky handwriting of their mother in a faded Bible margin. "I must keep them together," the same phrasing carved on the back of the photograph. Daniel stared at the note, then at the doll's disturbingly human eye, and a cold truth began to form between them, uninvited and heavy. The portrait wasn't meant to show a girl holding a doll, but a child holding the only memory of her lost twin, and someone, mother, father, or photographer, had tried to give that lost child a presence in the photograph, tried to capture something impossible, tried to preserve a life that never lived long enough to be seen. And when the image was developed, something appeared in the doll's face, something that didn't belong. Dr. Keaton was about to speak, about to piece together the final connection, when the archive lights flickered once, twice, then dimmed into a low, humming glow that cast the room in an uneasy amber. For days afterward, I kept going back to the portrait of Henry and the doll that wasn't truly a doll anymore. There was something in Victoria Weatherby's voice that stayed with me, a tremble, a hesitation, a heavy kind of remembering. People don't talk like that about harmless children's toys. And when I zoomed in on the photograph again, late one night, when the room was quiet and the only sound was the static hum of my computer, something struck me hard. The doll's face didn't just look older than the boy, it looked eerily similar to him. Not identical in the way twins are identical, but close enough that you would think they shared the same bone structure, the same long philtrum, the same small downward mouth. The face looked like a version of Henry that had lived through something he hadn't yet lived through, a tired, disappointed version, a version that had seen too much. And that was when I realized something even stranger. The doll's face wasn't perfectly symmetrical. One side sagged slightly lower, like the aftermath of an illness or a stroke. Dolls aren't carved like that. Craftsmen didn't make toys with medical conditions. The only dolls with asymmetry were the ones that weren't meant to be dolls at all. I sent the image to an expert in antique portrait retouching, a man named Ernest Wilkes, who had been studying early 1900s prints and negatives for nearly 40 years. He called me back the next morning, earlier than I expected, and before I could even say hello, he asked me a question in a tense, hushed tone. "Where did you find this?" I explained as calmly as I could. An estate box, an overlooked picture, a child holding what seemed to be an ordinary toy. He didn't say anything for a moment, and I could hear him tapping something metallic, maybe the edge of a loop against his desk.
"This isn't a doll," he finally said. "This is a retouched face. But it's not retouched onto the photograph, it's retouched onto the object the child is holding. Someone went through the trouble of grafting a real face onto this doll, and not just any face, a child's face." My stomach tightened. "A child's face," I repeated. "Yes," he said, "a deceased child's face." I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't believe him, but because the moment he said it, everything clicked. The sagging, the asymmetry, the hollowed eyes, it was not a sculpted expression. It was a preserved one. As I pressed him for more detail, Ernest sighed, the way someone sighs when they're about to tell you something they'd rather you didn't know. He explained that in the early 1900s, there was a lesser-known mourning practice involving memory dolls, but not the clean, decorative kind modern collectors know. These were dolls made by families who couldn't afford post-mortem photography or who wanted to keep a physical piece of their lost child. Sometimes it was a lock of hair, sometimes it was clothing, and in rare, unsettling cases, it was the child's actual cast face, made with plaster or wax, pressed directly from their features after death. They were meant to be kept private, almost sacred, a connection to the child they had lost. "But this," he whispered, "this isn't like any I've seen. This one looks altered." I asked him what he meant. He said the face had been tampered with twice, first when it was made, and then years later, digitally or photographically retouched to appear smoother in the portrait. He said someone tried to soften the death in it, but they didn't soften it enough. The revelation sent me back to the estate inventory. I searched for any reference to another child, a sibling, a cousin, anyone whose life might have ended too early. It didn't take long. In a family census record from 1903, I found the name: Evelyn Weatherby, age 6, a daughter, a sister, dead within the same year her name was recorded. There was no cause of death listed, just a dash, an omission common when the death was sudden, private, or something the family didn't want to discuss. My pulse quickened. If Evelyn died in 1903 and Henry's portrait was taken in 1905, then the doll he was holding, the one with the older, sagging face, might not just be a memory doll, it might be a distorted, artistic recreation of Evelyn, a sister he never got to grow up with. A sister he might not even have remembered, a sister whose face someone wanted to preserve so desperately that they turned it into an object he could hold, and then forced him to pose with it. I needed to understand more about the Weatherby family, so I dug deeper. Newspaper archives, handwritten diaries digitized by historical societies, local church logs. Eventually, I found a clue in the most unexpected place: a fire insurance ledger. In 1902, the Weatherby household filed a partial loss claim after a small fire destroyed an upstairs bedroom. The description was brief and clinical: one children's room damaged by smoke, bedding and personal effects unsalvageable. But beside that note, almost casually, someone had scribbled in faint pencil, "Mother insists it was the girl's room," which meant the room that burned was Evelyn's, which also meant that perhaps her belongings were not salvageable, including any early photographs of her. And if the family didn't have a picture, maybe that's why they created the doll. Maybe the doll wasn't a tribute. Maybe it was a replacement, a way to keep her close after the fire erased the only images they had. But if that were true, why did the doll's face look older than 6? Why did it look like it belonged to a child that had lived more years than she had? Why would someone age a lost child's memory? These questions churned through me as I traced the final pieces of the family's history. Henry Weatherby grew up, married, had children of his own, and lived a long life. But I found no mention of Evelyn, not in letters, not in records, not even in the few surviving family memoirs. It was as if she had been intentionally erased. And that was when I noticed something even more disturbing. In the portrait, Henry isn't smiling, not even the forced, stiff smile children often show in old photos. His expression is wary, almost frightened. His shoulders are slightly turned away from the doll, and his right hand, the one holding the doll upright, is pressed so tightly against it that the knuckles are blanched white. It isn't the grip of pride, it's the grip of obligation, or fear, or both. To confirm this unease, I contacted one last expert, a child behavior historian who specialized in early portraiture. When she examined the picture, she noticed something no one else had pointed out yet. She asked me to zoom into the shadow directly beneath the doll's chin. When I did, my breath caught. There was a faint, nearly invisible line, a hairline crack, running from the edge of the doll's jaw to the base of its neck. Not a crack created by age, a fracture created by impact. The expert explained that a blow like that would have come from being dropped or struck, hard. Children were rough with toys, but this doesn't look like rough play. This looks like something fell and shattered and was put back together. But why would a family repair a memorial object instead of remaking it? The answer was simple and horrifying. Because you can only cast a dead child's face once. Suddenly, the gesture in the photograph, the way the boy holds the doll, stiff and tense, made even more sense. Perhaps he had broken it once. Perhaps he had been reprimanded harshly.
An object that was more than a toy, more than a memory, more than a comfort. It was a weight, a burden, a reminder of something he had been forced to carry long before he was old enough to understand it. As I stared at the portrait again, everything about the image transformed. The sweetness dissolved, the innocence collapsed. The entire photograph, once warm and nostalgic, began to feel like a quiet tragedy disguised in lace and soft lighting. A child posing with another child, one alive, one preserved, both caught in time.